Have you ever asked questions like, if God forgives me of all my sins, then why should I fight against my sins? God will forgive me anyway, right? So where's the motivation? How about something like this? I should obey God even when I don't want to, but I should do it out of my own convictions. What? It's kind of confusing because they seem contradictory. These are called Christian life paradoxes. My name is Daniel, and in this workshop, we're going to learn how to think through these questions so that you can answer them yourself. Here's a definition of paradox. A paradox is a seemingly absurd or contradictory statement or proposition that, when investigated or explained, may prove to be well-founded or true. So, that means they are not actually a contradiction. It's a false contradiction. For instance, the opener example that I just gave, that Christians should obey, which means that we do things even when we don't feel like it. Now, is that true? Yes, that's true. That's what it means to obey someone, to do things even when we don't feel like doing that. But at the same time, Christians should do things out of our own convictions, which means that we don't just go through the motions. But what? We feel like there are two opposite things and we can't do these two things together at the same time. Worse yet, some preacher or some leader tells you one thing one week and telling you, hey, you need to obey God and not just listen to your emotions and feelings. And then the second week, the message tells you you should do things because of your own convictions. And you're like, what do you want? Is this a contradiction? But actually, as we look at this more carefully, it turns out that they're a false contradiction. It's a paradox. Okay, got that? So at this time, let's think of a Christian life contradiction or paradox that you can think of, some tension that confuses you. There will be a link provided in the chat, and you can put your questions, you can input your questions in there, and maybe it'll be covered during this workshop, but if not, we can try to answer that during the Q&A time afterwards. Okay, I'll give you 1 minute for that. Okay, time's up. But we'll leave that link open so that you can submit your questions throughout the workshop. All right, let's get going. So, how should we think through or talk through these paradoxes? Well, there are 3 steps. First step, imagine the extremes. Take the two things that seem contradictory. For example, the issue of obedience versus having your own convictions, okay? And imagine what it would be like if you only had just one, like it's all about obedience and never about personal convictions, or vice versa. And what you'll see is that the resulting picture becomes really ugly. So this first step actually motivates us to look for a way to combine the two. Okay? Second step, come up with relational examples, real life situations where you can have both, or maybe even expect both aspects to be there. This is a very powerful step because I think so many of our false contradictions arise from the fact that we treat God as a concept rather than a personhood, a personal being. So the moment that we start to think about your relationships, especially as you think about the meaningful relationships that people have, not like someone's relationship with your grocery store clerk, but like best friends or spouses and things like that, it turns out a lot of our false contradictions that we get confused by, they sort of solve themselves. Lastly, when possible, give biblical examples where these two things meet. So let's try these 3 steps now, okay? It's the example that we gave at the beginning of this workshop. God forgives all of my sins so I can have peace. Well, that's true. because of God's amazing grace. But at the same time, I'm supposed to fight against sin and really struggle against sin. Is that true? Of course. That's called sanctification. It's the classic tension between grace and sanctification. And here's how people treat this as a false contradiction. They say, like, let's say someone tells you, oh, you really need to struggle and fight against that sin, man, you know? And for some people, when they hear that, they say, hey, but what about grace? Some people even accuse other Christians who say such things as being legalistic. Wow, that's the extent to which people can think of these two very biblical topics as being contradictory. They are both very strong messages and teachings in the Bible. So how are we supposed to understand this? Okay, let's try those 3 steps for the situation. So let's imagine the extremes, okay? Someone who has all grace, but there's no struggle against sin whatsoever. So this person sleeps around, cheats people, lies about all sorts of things, and then says, hey, God forgives me, all right? I mean, that's the ugliest type of hypocritical Christians ever, right? On the other hand, if someone is all about having a clean life without sin, but there's no grace, well, that's a Pharisee. So both extremes are ugly. So that tells us we need to have both somehow. Step 2, come up with a relational example. Is there an example that you can come up with in human relationships where these two things are actually not in tension? And it turns out in our relationships and friendships, we actually see these two things playing themselves out together all the time. For example, let's say you stole your best friend's credit card and you spent like $1,000 on it and you put his credit card back. And then later you feel pretty rotten about it, so you repent and you confess to your friend, like, hey man, I stole this and I spent $1,000 on it. I'm sorry. And your friend's like, dude, that was really, really messed up and hurtful. And you say, yeah, I'm so sorry. I'll try to pay you back. I don't know if I'll have the money for a while, but I'm going to try. And this friend thinks about it for a little bit and says, you know what? We've been best friends for all of our lives. I don't want you to avoid me just because you can't pay me back. In fact, you don't have to pay me back. My friendship with you is worth more than $1,000. Wow, you know? You say, thank you so much. But let's say somehow you found out that this friend's loyalty to you is amazingly deep. Let's say you found out that this friend values his friendship with you so deeply that he would forgive you again if you stole his credit card again. Somehow you found out, okay? I mean, okay, he would be deeply pained and he would feel that sense of betrayal, but he would forgive you again, let's say. You know that. So, what's your response to that? Would you say, oh my gosh, I just found an unlimited bank account. Yeah! Okay, who would actually respond that way and decide to use your friend that way? Would you do that? If you would, then you need to take another workshop called, Workshop for Sociopaths. None of us, okay, would actually respond that way to a real person like that. Hopefully not, right? Well, what would you do? What would we do instead? I think we would say, oh my gosh, I just found the best friend ever. And how would you behave around him? I bet that you would want to please this friend even more, right? You would really try hard to be a good friend to that person as well, right? It turns out, when it comes to our personal relationships, when we really understand the depth of someone's forgiveness, it causes us to want to struggle against sin that much more. They are not in tension. Grace makes us want to fight against sin in our interpersonal relationships even more. So, how come, when it comes to God, this becomes a point of tension or contradiction and things like that? How come we treat God way worse than how we would treat anyone else? I think that's actually an indication that maybe we don't really think of God as a personal being. I think we mistakenly think of God as a thing. an inanimate object. And that's why we find it so easy to treat God not as a person, but as a thing that can be abused and used and like a principle to just use. Okay, biblical example. Actually, you might be surprised to find that there's a whole chapter in the Bible dedicated to this very question. It's in Romans chapter 6. People have been asking in that, in the Church of Rome, they've been saying, wait a minute, if God forgives us of our sins, then shall we sin more because we are now under grace? That's actually the exact quote of the question that was quoted in the beginning of chapter 6. That's exactly the same tension that we're talking about right now, right? And the answer that Apostle Paul gives in Romans 6 is fascinating. He says, by no means. And another translation puts it, God forbid, anathema or something. My translation would say, what the heck? Basically, he's saying, why in the world would you want to? Why in the world would you want to? You know what? Isn't that exactly what you would say to someone who tells you, hey, you know what? I found this amazing friend who forgave me of my $1,000 debt. And I think I can rip him off even more, right? Do you think I should do that? What would you say to that guy? You would say, what in the world? Like, God forbid, right? That's what Apostle Paul is saying. Like, again, it's a testament to how we don't treat God as a person. Apostle Paul says in Romans 6, do you not know that Christ died for you? And this is what we need to hear. You know, Jesus, he died for you. He died for me. By the way, that's way more than forgiving a $1,000 debt. And then he goes on to remind them of the gospel. Apostle Paul goes on to remind them of the gospel, saying, we were crucified with Christ and then raised with Christ. Why would you want to sin more in response to that gospel? So, Apostle Paul seems to think that if you're seriously contemplating these questions about, like, maybe I should sin more, then there is something fundamental about the gospel and salvation and maybe even God that you're missing. Okay. Now that you've learned it, here's a short quiz. Don't worry, you're not going to be graded on it. It's just a way for us to check our understanding, okay? So, in this paradox of grace and sanctification, the first step was imagine the extremes. So, here's the question. What's so terrible about having all grace and no sanctification? Okay, and the choices, is it 1, you get someone who is too gracious and forgiving? Or is it 2, you get a hypocrite who sins freely then claims God's forgiveness? Or 3, you get a Pharisee who judges others? Or 4, you get a fearful person unable to share the gospel with other people? Okay? You don't have to write it down anywhere or something like that. Just think about it for a few seconds. All right, settle on an answer. Or I guess if you're together with other people in a watch party, then you could show your answer with your fingers, 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? Okay, got it? All right, the answer is 2. All right, if you got that, that's good. Not really, that was really easy, okay? So, all right, next question. For the relational example step, here's the question. What was the point of the credit card stealing example? Is it, number 1, it's really wrong to steal from your best friend. 2, it's really messed up to abuse someone's grace towards you. 3, it's foolish to forgive someone again and again. Or 4, someone's grace towards you would cause you to want to struggle against sin even more. Okay. Think about it for a few seconds. Got it? All right. The answer is 4. All right. The point of that example was to show that when it comes to a real friend, then we would want to be even a better friend to that person. So it was meant to show that grace is not in contradiction to struggling against sin. It showed that grace can sometimes increase the desire for sanctification even more. Okay? All right. So let's move on. How about this? I feel like I'm doing my spiritual disciplines and coming to church as a duty. Isn't that wrong? Shouldn't I do it out of my love for God? Okay, I've heard this particular type of question being asked a lot. Okay, this person who is asking this question, this person is feeling a tension between two things, right? So here's the question. What are the two concepts that this person is seeing as a contradiction or are in tension? Okay, think about it for a moment. What is it? The answer is duty and love. Okay, duty versus love, or something close to that. Okay, actually, this falls under the same category as the example that we started this workshop with. It's the paradox of obedience and conviction. Okay, it's a similar idea. I should obey God even when I don't want to. Yeah, that's why we call it obedience, right? If you only did something after you were fully convinced of it and you wanted to do it, then that would not be obedience. That would just be like, I got convinced. Okay, but the other side of that is that we should do it out of our own convictions, out of our own desires, and not just go through the motions, right? These two things seem like they are in tension. So let's see if we can use the 3 steps that we just learned to talk through this. Let's imagine the extremes. All obedience, no conviction. That would be someone who's just going to obey without any personal conviction. Think about that, okay? I must admit, though, that picture isn't that ugly. It's not that bad because, look, at least that person is safe. Because this person won't murder me. Even though he might not have the strong personal conviction not to murder me, okay? It's like that person is just going to obey the 10 commandments not to murder, okay? At least this person will obey those commandments, not to murder, not to commit adultery and those things. But, okay, it's still pretty tragic. It's like someone who serves others and serves God. All the while, inside, this person really hates people and hates God. And God is not pleased with that. But what about the other way around? Okay, what if this person never obeys unless he is fully convicted to do so? I guess an example would be that's like after some group dinner that you've hosted, you tell someone, hey, while I wash the dishes, could you take the garbage out, please? And then this person goes, hold on, wait a minute. Let me consult my convictions about that, my own feelings about that. Am I doing this because you told me? Or am I going to do this because I personally want to? Would I do this without you asking me? Let me pray about that. And you go, actually, you know what? I don't think I'm doing it. I don't feel like I don't want to, because if I did it just because you told me, then I'll be a hypocrite for doing that. And you'll be like, okay. You will never invite this person to dinner again, Are there real life or relational examples, okay, so that where these two things work in tandem? So that's step number 2. Yes, there are so many examples of this in our lives where one leads to the other and one increases the other. Okay, so for example, brushing your teeth. Who had personal conviction about brushing your teeth when you were like 4 years old? No, none of us, right? When we were 4, it was pure obedience. Most of us hated brushing our teeth. And if you ever babysat a kid that age, you know that you got to make them brush their teeth. And they will lie to you about it too, man. Like they'll like put some toothpaste on their lips and he goes, I brushed my teeth. Like you got to check, So for kids, it's pure obedience. But right now, you do have personal conviction about dental hygiene, right? Yes, you do. I hope you do. If you don't, if you're still lying about brushing your teeth, well, then you got problems again. So how did you develop that conviction? How did that conviction grow? Well, it grew because we obeyed. And as you obeyed, at a certain point, your convictions grew, and now it became something that you want to do, something that you actually need to do every night. And if you don't, you feel bad, right? It feels nasty. Well, let me pause here for a bit to give a word of encouragement. I know that given the strange times that we've been going through in the past year, our spiritual lives and our spiritual disciplines have become harder. Without, even apart from the COVID-19 situation, I think that's just generally the case many times. Without people around us to encourage us, even something as simple as going to church or something like that, or reading the Bible, without other people to do this with, it's been hard. And sometimes it's just, you've just been pushing through. out of pure obedience, even though, we don't want to. Well, I don't think we should be so shaken by that. I think that's just part of growing. It's okay that it feels like you're just obeying and pushing through, because this example or this paradox shows us that continual obedience can and often does lead to forming stronger convictions. So let's really keep at it. So that's an example of conviction growing because of obedience. But there are examples going in the other direction, the opposite direction. Let's think about an athlete who really, really wants to run faster. He really wants to run faster. So he has personal and very strong personal convictions about that. If this athlete is extremely motivated, okay, what does he do? Well, he gets himself a personal coach so that that personal coach can now tell him and force him to wake up in the morning, do these exercises, and keep him on track, so that even when he doesn't want to, the coach will make him, get up at 6 a.m. and run that mile. I don't want to, do it. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because it illustrates that our great convictions would sometimes cause us to put ourselves in a situation where we force ourselves to obey. Okay, that's an example of conviction causing increased obedience. Actually, if you're a student, especially if you're a college student, you know what this is about, right? You're doing this right now. The fact that you actually paid money, sometimes a lot of money, and go through a lot of pain to attend college. I mean, think about that. What does that show? Multiple choice again. This time just two choices. One, out of our conviction to get an education, we voluntarily put ourselves into a high-pressure situation so that we will be forced to learn, okay, showing that our convictions can lead us to force ourselves to obey even when we don't want to. Or two, out of the conviction that we want a college degree, we are willing to pay money to go through college legally so that our convictions and desires can make us obey the law of the land. Okay, which is it? Okay, what's the point of the illustration here? All right. Go ahead and reread it if you need to. Ready? The answer is 1. Okay. All right, that was pretty easy. All right, one final example, which I think is a pretty powerful example that shows that these two things, the obedience and convictions, can increase at the very same time. Okay, when we have children, you will actually experience this. 2 or 3 times a night, the child will wake up in the middle of the night and just starts to cry because he or she is hungry or just for no reason at all. So what does the mother or the father do? Let's say every single cell in her body tells her, don't get up, stay down. Let's say she even has a headache. She doesn't feel like getting up at all. But let's say she really, really pushes herself through that. And going against all of her desires, she forces her to get up, to hold the child, and to feed the child. Okay, so in that situation, are these two things in tension? Is that parent somehow less loving because he or she had to force himself to do that? Does that show that that person had less love? No. In fact, the more the parent has to push against his own desires, the greater the love, isn't it? I think we recognize that. So this idea that if I really loved God, if I really, really love someone, then I should never have to force myself to do anything because it would just I would just naturally want to do that. Well, that's just an immature picture of love. And vice versa. When people say, if you have to do something when you don't really want to, then it's not really true love. It's not true conviction. And in order to develop my true conviction, I need to it has to sort of come naturally to me. I need to somehow find a situation where it'll be natural. Well, that's also derived from an immature picture of conviction and love. It's a false contradiction. All right. Are there any biblical examples of these two things going together? Quiz again. 1, Jesus healing the leper and even touching him. 2, Jesus confronting the Pharisees out of his love for them. 3, Jesus at Gethsemane praying, "Let this cup pass from me, but not as I will, but as you will." Or 4, Jesus saying, "If you love me, then you will obey me." Okay? All right, which one would be a biblical example of obedience and conviction going together? Just think about it. All right, got it? Got it? Okay. The answer is both 3 and 4. All right. If you answered 3 or 4, then you are right. Okay. 4 is a direct command, actually, from the Bible. Jesus saying, "If you love me, you will obey me." That's from John chapter 14, by the way. But I actually think number 3 is the most powerful example from the Bible. You know, Jesus at Gethsemane, he was praying, "Let this cup pass from me." It's pretty clear that Jesus did not want to go to the cross. Okay, he did not naturally feel like getting tortured to death. But out of his obedience to God the Father, he said, "Not as I will, but as you will. Let your will be done." Okay. It wasn't his will. He obeyed the Father. So does that mean Jesus suffered from some kind of lack of personal conviction or love? Because he had to force himself to go to the cross, right? Do you feel like, oh, then I guess Jesus didn't really love me, because if he really loved me, then it would have been so easy and natural for him? Do you feel like that? No, quite the opposite. We actually see in that moment of Gethsemane just how much Jesus loved us and how much he loved his Father. So here's an example of Jesus himself, right? That conviction drives obedience, and obedience becomes the proof of conviction. They go hand in hand. Okay, one last paradox to think through, and we're going to do this a little differently this time. We have this animated character, and we're going to listen to him say something that exemplifies a false contradiction. So let's listen and try to identify the false contradiction, okay?
Like you're like telling me, I shouldn't have snapped at my roommate or slammed the door on his arm because I was mad. Okay, but the point. Okay, the point is that the Bible says God looks at the heart, not the outer appearance, not external behavior. God looks at the heart. You know what I'm saying? God looks at the heart. That's what the Bible says. Well, the Pharisees looked at the outer appearance. You see? So I'm just kind of like wondering about that. Like, you just keep on looking at my outer appearance, and look at my heart. Like, what about the heart? Why don't you look at what God looks at?
All right, so what are the two things that seem to be in tension with each other here? Well, at least in the character's mind, okay? What are those two things? The answer is heart versus external behavior. Those are the two things that are in tension, okay? And in this character's mind, those two things are so opposed to each other that he assumes that if someone is looking at the external behavior, then that necessarily means that the person is not looking at the heart. So that's why this would be a false contradiction. And this actually is a very commonly held false contradiction. Okay, so let's practice our skills on this. First, imagine the extremes. I think we can actually skip this step, the first step of the imagine the extremes, because this character is already in the extreme. Okay, he's sort of a ridiculous caricature already, where he says it doesn't matter if I'm this jerk because God looks at the heart, not external behavior. So let's just skip this one and go to the relational example. Okay, so I'll give you a minute here to try to think of a relational example of where a situation where these two things go hand in hand. Okay, I'm gonna give you a hint. Try to think of a meaningful relationship, like a deep friendship or marriage, and think about a specific scenario or an imaginary situation where you would expect these two things to go together, okay? So come up with a scenario and jot down a few words. Okay, hope you were able to think of an example. Whatever your example was, okay, it should have expounded or touched upon the fact that over a period of time, we do expect our behaviors to arise out of our hearts. Okay, so what I mean is, yes, there are times when our external behaviors don't reflect our hearts, and there's a brokenness there, like a break there. And sometimes we can use our nice external behaviors to even hide our evil intentions and all that stuff. I think whatever example you gave, though, you do need to acknowledge that there is this breakdown between our hearts and our behaviors. But we understand that those incidents are like specific incidents. But if that becomes a dominant pattern, I think we can say that, hey, I think you have good reasons to wonder about the heart, right? For example, if someone you are dating says, hey, my heart is completely yours, you are the only one for me, but their external behavior is that they pursue other romantic relationships and they cheat on you, and this is a pattern, let's say, well, then you have really good reasons to suspect their hearts. Even if they feel like they really mean it, maybe they are self-deceived. I think this can be directly applied to our spiritual lives. In Christian life, I think we can be so easily caught up in saying things and expressing our hearts through songs, through words. And I'm not knocking that because I think those are really good things and necessary things. But if year after year, what you do with your body, what you go after, what you choose to prioritize in terms of time and resources, if those things are not much different from the rest of the world, we should think, maybe my external behavior is not a departure from the heart. Maybe it's a window into my true heart. Okay, so what about biblical examples? Like we talked about, there is a distinction that is made between heart and external behavior in the Bible. So looking at your external behavior does not always show you the true state of your heart. Okay, but I think we have to make this very important observation. The Bible applies that principle, of God caring about the state of our hearts and is not fooled by external behavior. That principle. The Bible only applies that principle in one direction. In situations when the external behavior is good in order to hide an evil heart. Like the Pharisees, where they were acting all holy, but inside they were filled with greed and lusts. But we should notice the Bible does not apply that same principle in the other direction, where you somehow have a very good heart inside, but your behavior is evil. Okay? If you're behaving in an evil way, God doesn't say, hey, that's okay because I look at your heart. God doesn't say this because basically this picture doesn't happen. It just does not happen. I mean, when we have an evil or selfish thoughts inside, there are plenty of social reasons why we would want to act caring and unselfish. But if you have a good, caring heart, there's no reason why you would act selfish and evil. Jesus tells us in Matthew 7, you shall know the tree by its fruit. I think that analogy is actually very insightful in that sometimes it takes time for a tree to bear its fruit, but over time, the pattern emerges and the heart is revealed. Well, that's it for us. Hope this workshop was helpful for you and hope you can remember to apply these 3 steps to think through some of the confusing Christian life paradoxes. All right, bye.